There are dependencies that populations never consider until grocery store shelves begin to empty. Food security is assumed to be permanent in wealthy nations with advanced agricultural systems and global supply chain access. The belief is that modern economies have transcended historical vulnerabilities to famine, crop failure, and resource scarcity through technological advancement and market integration. That belief is encountering mathematical realities that technology cannot overcome and markets cannot solve. The American food system, which feeds 330 million people and exports agricultural products worth over $180 billion annually, is built on inputs that are increasingly controlled by a single neighboring country. And that country has begun the quiet process of ensuring that the United States understands exactly how fundamental those dependencies have become. This is not about crop failures that will reverse when weather improves. This is about permanent shifts in agricultural geography driven by climate conditions, soil depletion, and resource availability that are making Canadian territory essential to American food production in ways that cannot be replaced through domestic alternatives. Most Americans believe that the United States is agriculturally self-sufficient. The Great Plains produce wheat. The Midwest produces corn and soybeans. California supplies fruits and vegetables. The assumption is that American agriculture is robust, diversified, and independent of foreign inputs that could be restricted during disputes. That assumption is dangerously incomplete. American agricultural production depends on three critical inputs that are increasingly sourced from Canada: potash fertilizer, livestock feed, and the water necessary for irrigation in regions where domestic supplies are failing. Without reliable access to these Canadian resources, American agricultural output would decline by margins that would transform the United States from a food exporter to a food importer within a single growing season. The mathematics of potash dependency are particularly stark. Potash, a potassium compound essential for crop fertilization, cannot be substituted with alternative nutrients without severe yield reductions. Soil that is depleted of potassium will not produce viable crops, regardless of how much nitrogen or phosphorus is applied. Canada controls approximately 48% of global potash reserves and produces roughly 32% of annual global supply. The Saskatchewan deposits, which have been mined for over a century, represent the largest and highest quality potash reserves accessible anywhere on Earth. No other country has comparable reserves that could be developed quickly enough to replace Canadian supply if it were restricted. American agriculture consumes approximately 9.2 million metric tons of potash annually. Of that total, approximately 6.8 million tons are imported from Canada through rail networks and distribution systems that were built specifically to move Saskatchewan potash to American farm regions. In October 2025, the Saskatchewan provincial government announced the formation of the Strategic Resource Management Authority, a regulatory body tasked with ensuring that provincial resources are managed for the long-term benefit of Saskatchewan residents and that export policies align with provincial economic development priorities. The announcement was framed as a resource stewardship initiative focused on sustainable development. But agricultural economists in the United States immediately recognized the strategic implications. The Strategic Resource Management Authority was given authority to review all resource export contracts, to establish quotas that prioritize domestic needs, and to require value-added processing within Saskatchewan before authorizing exports. These authorities created a framework where potash exports to the United States could be restricted, redirected, or conditioned on terms that served Saskatchewan's economic interests. American agricultural industry representatives who contacted Saskatchewan officials seeking reassurance about continued potash access received responses emphasizing that Saskatchewan would continue to be a reliable supplier to customers who demonstrated long-term commitment and who offered competitive terms. The carefully worded language implied that potash access was no longer guaranteed based on historical relationships, but would be determined by market conditions and political considerations that could change. American fertilizer companies that had operated under long-term contracts with fixed pricing suddenly faced the prospect that those contracts might not be renewed or that renewal would require substantially higher prices. The market responded immediately. Potash futures prices increased by 31% within 6 weeks, as agricultural buyers recognized that Canadian suppliers now possessed leverage that could be used to extract premium prices or to favor non-American customers willing to pay more. But the potash dependency represented only one dimension of Canadian leverage over American food security. The livestock feed situation created even more immediate vulnerabilities that could affect American food supplies within months rather than years. American cattle, hog, and poultry operations depend heavily on feed grains, particularly barley and canola meal, that are produced primarily in Canadian prairie provinces. The feedlot operations in states like Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska were built on the assumption that Canadian feed grains would always be available at prices that made large-scale livestock production economically viable. Climate conditions and agricultural economics have made Canadian feed and grain production increasingly valuable, while simultaneously reducing American production in regions where water scarcity and soil degradation are making grain farming marginal. In November 2025, Canadian agricultural provinces implemented new regulations requiring that livestock feed produced from provincial crops be processed through provincial facilities before export, with priority given to Canadian livestock operations during supply constraints. The regulations meant that American feedlot operators could no longer simply purchase raw Canadian grain for direct feeding to American livestock. Instead, they would need to purchase processed feed products at higher prices, and only after Canadian domestic demand had been satisfied. The effect on American meat production was immediate. Feedlot operators in the Southwest saw their input costs increase by margins that made continued operations economically questionable. Several large operations announced plans to relocate to Canadian provinces where feed supplies were more reliable and prices were lower due to proximity to production. The jobs being lost were not abstract statistics for future decades. Livestock operations in Texas and Kansas were closing in real time, with employment impacts affecting rural communities that had few alternative economic opportunities. By January 2026, American beef production had declined by approximately 8% compared to the previous year, with further reductions projected as feedlot closures continued. Retail beef prices increased by an average of $2.40 per pound, creating political pressure on federal officials to address supply disruptions that were affecting food costs for consumers across the country. Canadian beef production, meanwhile, was expanding rapidly as operations relocated from the United States and as new facilities were built to take advantage of reliable feed supplies and growing international demand. The shift represented a permanent transfer of agricultural production capacity from the United States to Canada, driven by resource availability that policy interventions could not change. The wheat production dynamics revealed another dimension of Canadian agricultural leverage that was tied directly to climate change and soil degradation patterns that were making American agricultural regions less productive while simultaneously improving conditions in Canadian territory. The American Great Plains, which have historically been one of the world's most productive wheat-growing regions, are experiencing soil moisture declines, increased frequency of drought conditions, and temperature patterns that are reducing wheat yields even when adequate water is available. Soil studies conducted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture have documented degradation across major wheat-producing regions, with organic matter content declining and nutrient depletion occurring at rates that exceed natural restoration, even with intensive fertilizer application. These are not temporary conditions that will reverse with changed farming practices. These are permanent soil quality reductions driven by a century of intensive agriculture that depleted reserves faster than natural processes could restore them. Canadian prairie provinces, in contrast, are experiencing climate conditions that are extending growing seasons, increasing precipitation in key agricultural regions, and making previously marginal farmland viable for wheat production. The northward shift of viable agricultural territory is creating a situation where Canada is becoming a more productive wheat producer, while the United States is becoming less productive. By 2027, according to agricultural projections from both the USDA and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Canadian wheat production will exceed American production for the first time in recorded history. The shift represents a fundamental change in North American agricultural geography that will have permanent implications for food security, export markets, and economic power. American wheat farmers watching their yields decline year after year while seeing Canadian production expand are confronting decisions about whether to continue operations that are becoming economically marginal or to sell their land and exit agriculture entirely. The generational knowledge and infrastructure being lost cannot be easily recovered even if climate conditions somehow reversed. Canadian officials have been strategically positioning the country to take maximum advantage of this agricultural transition. Rather than simply exporting raw wheat to traditional customers, Canadian agricultural policy has focused on developing domestic processing capacity, value-added production, and direct market access that bypasses American intermediaries. In December 2025, the Canadian Wheat Board, which had been privatized in 2012, was reestablished as a federal crown corporation with a mandate to coordinate wheat marketing, ensure stable prices for Canadian farmers, and maximize the value of Canadian wheat in international markets. The re-establishment of the Wheat Board gave Canadian federal officials direct control over wheat export policies, pricing strategies, and market allocation decisions. Instead of individual farmers or private companies negotiating independently with international buyers, the federal government could now use wheat exports as a strategic tool to build diplomatic relationships and economic partnerships. The implications became clear when the Wheat Board announced in January 2026 that it had signed long-term supply agreements with Egypt, Indonesia, and several African countries that guaranteed Canadian wheat supplies at prices below what those countries had been paying to American exporters. The strategy was transparent. Canada was using its increasing wheat production capacity and its coordinated export system to build market share in regions where American wheat exporters had historically dominated. Once those relationships were established and supply chains were built around Canadian wheat, those customers would be unlikely to switch back to American suppliers, even if American production recovered. American wheat farmers found themselves competing not just with individual Canadian farmers, but with a coordinated national strategy backed by government resources and diplomatic support. The playing field was not level, and there was no mechanism through which American producers could respond effectively. The soybean situation created similar dynamics with additional complications related to processing capacity and specialized varieties that American agriculture had dominated for decades but was now losing to Canadian competition. Soybeans require specific climate conditions, particular soil types, and processing infrastructure to convert raw beans into oil and meal products that serve industrial and agricultural markets. The United States had historically possessed advantages in all three areas, making American soybeans the global standard for quality and reliability. Climate change is eroding those advantages. Temperature and precipitation patterns that had made the American Midwest ideal for soybean production are shifting northward into Canadian territory. Simultaneously, soil degradation in American fields is reducing yields even in years with favorable weather. Canadian investment in soybean processing infrastructure has created capacity that rivals American facilities, eliminating the processing advantage that had historically kept Canadian soybeans dependent on American crushing facilities. And Canadian agricultural research institutions have developed soybean varieties specifically adapted to Canadian growing conditions, producing beans that meet international quality standards without requiring American genetics or expertise. By 2026, Canadian soybean production had increased to levels that were beginning to compete with American exports in Asian markets where both countries were seeking market share. The Canadian advantage in this competition was not just agricultural productivity, but also diplomatic relationships and trade agreements that gave Canadian soybeans preferential access to markets where American products faced tariffs or regulatory barriers. The canola situation represented the most dramatic example of how Canadian agricultural leverage was being constructed through crop selection, market development, and strategic positioning that gave Canada control over agricultural products that the global food system increasingly required. Canola, a Canadian-developed oilseed crop, has become essential for food processing, industrial lubricants, and biodiesel production. Canada produces approximately 75% of global canola supply, giving Canadian producers and Canadian government officials extraordinary leverage over an agricultural commodity that has no easy substitutes in many applications. American food processors, biodiesel producers, and industrial companies that depend on canola are entirely reliant on Canadian supplies. There are no alternative sources that could replace Canadian canola if exports were restricted. And there is no possibility of developing American canola production at scales that would reduce dependence on Canadian supply, because climate conditions and soil types in the United States are not suitable for large-scale canola cultivation. In February 2026, the Canadian Canola Growers Association, working with federal agricultural officials, announced the formation of a canola export consortium that would coordinate sales to international customers and ensure that domestic Canadian processing needs were met before authorizing exports. The consortium structure meant that American buyers would need to negotiate with a coordinated Canadian entity rather than purchasing from individual farmers or exporters. The leverage created by this coordination allowed Canadian sellers to demand premium prices and to attach conditions to sales agreements that served Canadian strategic interests. American companies that attempted to secure long-term canola supply contracts found themselves competing with European and Asian buyers, who were willing to offer higher prices and more favorable terms. The result was that American companies faced either paying substantially more for canola or accepting supply uncertainty that could disrupt operations during periods of high demand or supply constraints. The dairy situation created additional complexities because it involved not just agricultural production, but also regulatory systems and trade agreements that had been designed to protect American dairy producers from Canadian competition. Canada's supply management system, which controls dairy production through quotas and pricing mechanisms, has historically been a point of contention in trade negotiations with the United States. American negotiators have consistently sought to dismantle supply management to allow American dairy products greater access to Canadian markets. But climate change and agricultural economics are creating a situation where Canadian dairy production is becoming more competitive, even without regulatory changes. Canadian dairy operations are benefiting from abundant water supplies, cooler temperatures that reduce heat stress on cattle, and access to feed grains at lower costs than American operations face in regions experiencing water scarcity and feed price increases. By 2025, Canadian dairy productivity per cow exceeded American averages, and Canadian production costs were declining while American costs were rising. If supply management were eliminated, as American negotiators have been demanding, Canadian dairy products could flood American markets and drive American dairy farmers out of business. American dairy industry representatives found themselves in the awkward position of no longer wanting the market access to Canada that they had been demanding for decades, because that same market access would allow Canadian products to compete in American markets where they would have cost advantages. The political irony was profound. American negotiators had spent years trying to force Canada to open its dairy markets, only to discover that opening those markets would primarily benefit Canadian producers who could now compete effectively in American territory. The cumulative effect of these agricultural dependencies across fertilizer, feed grains, wheat, soybeans, canola, and dairy created a situation where American food security was increasingly reliant on Canadian cooperation and Canadian policy decisions that prioritized Canadian interests. American agricultural industry assessments conducted in late 2025 estimated that disruptions to Canadian agricultural imports would reduce American food production by approximately 18% within a single growing season, with cascading effects on food processing, transportation, retail, and food service sectors that depend on stable agricultural supplies. The economic cost of such disruptions would exceed $340 billion annually, but the political and social costs would be even more severe. Food price increases of the magnitude that would result from supply disruptions would create political crises that would transcend partisan divisions and would force immediate policy responses regardless of other strategic considerations. Canadian officials understood this leverage and were using it strategically to reshape agricultural trade relationships that had historically favored American interests. Instead of accepting terms dictated by larger American markets, Canadian provinces and federal agencies were setting conditions for agricultural exports that maximized Canadian economic benefits, while reducing American ability to take Canadian supplies for granted. The transformation was occurring without dramatic announcements or explicit threats. There were no export bans, no trade wars, no diplomatic confrontations. There was only the steady implementation of policies that gave Canadian authorities greater control over agricultural resources and greater flexibility to prioritize Canadian interests. American consumers watching food prices increase at grocery stores had no awareness that those price increases were partly driven by Canadian policy decisions about how to allocate agricultural production. American farmers, struggling with declining yields and rising input costs, did not recognize that those struggles were accelerating a permanent shift of agricultural capacity from American to Canadian territory. By the time these dynamics became widely understood, the restructuring of North American agriculture would already be complete.